Hello, I'm Pramod Pandey from the Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today, we will talk about testing hypotheses and rule interaction in generative phonology. In the last module, we looked at the model of generative phonology, the importance of phonological rules in the model of generative phonology. Now, in today's module, we will try to look at the various considerations that are brought to bear in choosing between phonological analyses. That means in deciding on the formulations of the phonological rules in the grammar. So the main objectives are to illustrate the working of interactions among phonological rules and alternations, and to weigh the factors that help decide the underlying representations of alternating forms. As we said earlier, that the underlying representation is crucial in phonological analysis in generative grammar. When a morpheme has alternating shapes, which of the two alternating shapes is the underlying form, so that a surface phonetic form can be predicted by means of phonological rules. As we will notice, there is more than one possible rule. Which of them is the correct rule? Secondly, there may be multiple rules, correct rules. How do the rules interact with each other in such a way that the grammar is simple and that the surface phonetic form can be properly predicted? So the focus of the module is to sort of provide an overview of the criteria used in choosing between analyses. Let us look at the data involving alternations in this African language. We notice the alternations in two columns. Column A and B, both of them are complex forms. Column A has the singular morpheme as a prefix, and column B has a plural morpheme as the prefix. The stem in the two forms is the same. For example, in this case here, these noun forms of the noun. Notice that in the odd numbered words, namely 1, 3, 5, and 7, we have the stem is bati, daha, jejele, and gunia. In both the columns, we find the same morpheme. For knife, bati, chibati, zimbati. For wings, we have ludaha, zindaha. For chains, we have lujejele, and then we have zinjejele. And then finally, we have kangunia and zingunia. You will notice that whereas the morpheme for the singular, the form for the singular morpheme is variant, that is, we have chi, ka, lu. For the form for the plural morpheme is more or less consistent, in the sense that the plural morpheme begins with z and then followed by the vowel e, and then we have these four nasals, namely ma, na, nya, and nga. So let us ignore the variation in the singular morpheme and concentrate on the plural forms. as well as on the stem, forms of the stem. So please notice, to repeat, 1, 3, 5 and 7 have stems which are invariant, that is Bati and Daha and Jejele and Gunia. But in 2, 4 and 6, that is the even numbered words, there is an alternation in the stem form. We are not concerned right now with the choice of the nasal consonant before the stem in the plural forms, that is whether it is ma or na, or nya, etc. That is predictable. But for now we will concentrate only on the stem forms. So the stem in 2, 4 and 6 varies. In 2, for a small dog we have hua, but in the plural we have bua. In 4 we have luli, that is li is the stem for root and di is the stem for roots, in roots. Then we have yo-yo, which means bud, pronounced as joyo in the plural form. Now, how do we describe the alternation in the forms of the stems in 2, 4 and 6? 1, 3, 5 and 7 are no problem, so we will ignore them. We have to account for the alternation in 2, 4 and 6 forms. The alternations involve the following segments. To repeat, verba, lerda and yerja. What is the difference between the two sets? Notice that va, la and yer, all the three are approximants, whereas ba, da and ja, these are plosives. So we have approximants, va, la, ya, versus plosives or obstruents, ba, da and ja. The important question is, between the two alternations, namely vua versus bua, li versus di, and yele versus jejele, which of the two must be seen to be basic? Take a look at the data again. 2, 4 and 6. Do we consider bua to be the basic and hua to be derived by rule? Di to be basic and li to be derived by rule? Jejele to be basic and yejele to be derived by rule? Or do we look at it from the other point of view, namely hua is basic and bua is derived? So va is in the underlying form, ba is the surface form, la is the underlying form, da is the surface form, or yo is the underlying form, and jo, yo-yo and joyo is the derived form. That's the question. So if we choose the plosive to be the underlying form, then the rule must be that the plosive changes to an approximant intervocalically. So ba changes to va between two vowels, in this case a and u, kavua. Or lu, li, the changes to la between u and e. Jejele, j changes to ya between a and a. The condition is that the approximant must be between two vowels. And the other rule, namely if the approximant changes to the plosive, then the environment must be that the approximant changes to plosive when preceded by a nasal in the same place. So how do we decide between the underlying forms, between the two rules to predict the relation between the underlying form and the surface phonetic form? Notice that with the plosive changing to approximant between two vowels, is it the case that we never find plosives between two vowels? We find that if we make such an assertion, then the assertion is going to be proved false because in 1, 3, 5, and 7 we have plosives between two vowels. So these constitute counter-evidence for the assertion, for the rule that plosives become approximants between two vowels. On the other hand, if we assume that the approximants become plosives, the approximants are the underlying form, they become plosives after homoorganic nasals in the same place, then what we find is this assertion never meets with any counter-evidence. In all the 7 cases, we have the plosives occurring after the nasal consonants. So the second rule, which assumes that the approximant is the underlying form and the plosive is the derived form, is the one which is acceptable. So in the grammar of this language, we will assume that the rule is approximant becomes plosive, not the other way around. So counter-evidence is one of the main criteria for choosing between rules or choosing between phonological analyses. When we are faced with the data on alternation, then between the two alternating forms, which one is basic will be determined by which one has no counter-evidence. The one which has no counter-evidence is chosen as the correct rule of the grammar, and the analysis is considered to be the correct analysis of the alternating forms in this language. But sometimes it is not always possible to find counter-evidence when we have limited data especially. Let's take a look at the examples from Polish. In Polish, we have an alternation between s, an alveolar consonant or a post-alveolar fricative, and sh, which is a pre-palatal fricative. So we have pash and pashe, raz, raze, brat, brache, and chut, chuje, zvon, zvonie. So in Polish, we have these alternations between alveolar, post-alveolar obstruents and nasal, sa, za, ta, da, na, and pre-palatal obstruents and nasal. Now again, the two possible analyses, we either assume that the pre-palatal consonants are the underlying consonants and that the alveolar, post-alveolar consonants are the derived ones, or the opposite, that is the alveolar consonant is the basic underlying and pre-palatal consonant is the derived. Now notice that in this case, it is difficult to find counter-evidence. We don't get data which says that one of the two rules is incorrect and the other is correct. When we are faced with data of this kind, where a clear choice of one of the two rules is not possible because of the unavailability of counter-evidence, then what do we do? Here we take a recourse to phonetic plausibility. Phonetic plausibility. Now in this case, we will notice that the assumption that the underlying form is the pre-palatal one and that the pre-palatal becomes alveolar at the end of words, there seems to be no real phonetic motivation. Why should it be so? What is special in the environment of word finality that it does not allow pre-palatal consonants? On the other hand, if we assume that the alveolar is the basic and the pre-palatal is derived, before the vowel A, that is a front vowel, then we see that there can be a phonetic relationship between a front vowel A and the pre-palatal consonant sh or nya, etc. Now, a third case where we do not have a very clear case of counter evidence as such, nor phonetic plausibility. Then what happens? Then in such a case, what we find is that the criterion of simplicity of description and generality of description, which means generality of course also means that there is no counter evidence to the generalizations arrived at. And simplicity, by simplicity, it means that you have the minimal number of rules to account for the data. Now let's take a look at this complex alternations in Tibetan numerals. On the screen you have 3 columns. In column 1 you have simple numerals. The examples are for the words 1, 4, 5, 9 and 10. In column 2 we have complex numerals for the words between 11 and 20. So we have a word, for example, 11, 14, 15, 19. Thus, 11 is formed with the prefix u, which means, notice that at the bottom we have u means 10. So you have 10 plus 1 seems to be making 11. 10 plus 4 is making 14. 10 plus 5 is making 15, and 10 plus 9 is making 19. A simple process of forming these words. 10 plus 1, 10 plus 2, 10 plus 3, 10 plus 4, etc. There is, however, a consonant which is inserted between the 2 morphemes. Incremental consonant. In the first 2 words, 11, 14, we have a g, which is not present in column 1. We also have a r, which is not present in column 1. So u is 10 and 9, that makes it 19. But instead of getting yu gu, we are getting yurgu. Similarly, in 14, instead of getting yu shi, we are getting yuk shi. Instead of getting yu yig for 11, we are getting yu gig. And in column 3, for the words multiples of 10, like 20, 30, 40, we have examples of 40 and 40, 50 and 90 here. The word formation seems to be different. In this case, what we have is, we have the word for the cardinal numbers 1, etc. comes first, and then the word for 10 comes later. So 40 is she, bu. Now notice that u stands for 10 and she stands for 4 in column 1. So here it is 4, 10. Instead of 10, 4 in column 2, we have 4, 10, 4, 5, 50, and 9, 10, 90, 5, 10, 50. Here also we get an incremental consonant here. Instead of getting she, you, we are getting she, bu. Instead of getting gu, you, we are getting gu, bu. Now the problem before us is, where does the additional form, the incremental consonant, come from? Is it basic or is it underlying? Or is it underlying or is it derived? If it is underlying, that means that it undergoes deletion. If it is derived, that means there is addition of the incremental consonant in the given environments. So, we also have another problem, namely, the incremental consonant is different in these cases. So, we have g occurring in 2 words here, b occurring in other 2 words, then we have r occurring is in another word. So, we get g or b or r, and there doesn't seem to be any clear phonological reason or grounding for these incremental consonants. Now, if we try to account for the incremental consonant leading to alternation, we have 3 different possibilities. We can formulate 3 different hypotheses. These hypotheses are termed here as insertion hypothesis, which says that the additional segment g, b, etc. are inserted between the 2 morphemes. Then we have final deletion hypothesis. Deletion is 2. One is final, that means the additional segments belong to the preceding morpheme and are deleted when they occur alone. And C is deletion hypothesis, initial deletion hypothesis, which says the additional segments belong to the following morpheme and are deleted initially when the morpheme occurs alone. Which of them is simpler and more general? If you look at the 3 different analyses, what we find is that the insertion hypothesis will have to be morphologically conditioned. We must assume that in some cases the g is inserted, in the other cases r is inserted, and some other cases b is inserted. So, and the other is if it is deletion, if we think that the ending consonant is deleted, then we have yug yig, yug shi, and you have yur gu, ra is deleted, you have gub yu and shib yu. So, we have the consonant at the end of the preceding stem which is deleted. If we take the last hypothesis, that is initial consonant deletion, then what we find is that we have a fairly consistent explanation, and the consistency lies in this, that is, when the stem occurs alone, then the complex onset is avoided, leading to the first consonant being deleted. So, we get for 11, in the case of 1, we assume that the underlying form is gig. For she, it is gshi. For yurgu, it is rgu. And then for you, it is bu. So, we get for 10, it is bu, bu, bu. Now, why should the initial deletion hypothesis be preferred over the final deletion hypothesis? For the final deletion hypothesis, what we find is that to assume that we have yug, yur, in all these cases, we must assume that the consonants are different, and we cannot account for why such a consonant is absent in the form in 15. For 15, we have yu nga. Why not something like yug nga or yur nga? There is no account for it. Whereas, for the initial deletion hypothesis, we assume that morphemes can have consonant clusters, or morphemes can have single consonants. If the morpheme begins with a consonant cluster, then the first consonant is deleted. So that's the account. Take a look at the data once again for your satisfaction. Now, a last case of interaction among phonological rules. So far we have looked at examples which require for us to choose between analyses, and the criteria that we use. The criteria we found that we use in choosing between analyses are: 1, counter-evidence; in the absence of it, phonetic plausibility; if both are present, it is better; and then simplicity and generality. In the case of Tibetan numerals, the hypothesis that is selected and the phonological rule that is proposed is one which is the simplest without any counter-evidence, and it is of a more general kind. Now, what happens when more than one phonological rule accounts for alternation in a grammar? For example, we looked at in the last module, we looked at the alternation among the regular plural morpheme. Now let's take a look at the regular past morpheme, with which also you will be very familiar. As you all know, that the regular past morpheme has 3 alternate forms: t, d, and id, as shown on the screen for you. So how do you account for the alternation? You see, in the C we have id, and in AB we have t, d. So either we say that E is deleted in the columns A and B before t, d in A and B, or we say that E is inserted in C. The underlying form is either T or D, and then there is insertion. And the second phenomenon to be taken into account is either voicing or devoicing. We either assume that d is devoiced to t, or we assume that t is voiced to d. When we look at the possibilities of accounting for the data in a simple way, and the relationship amongst these two phenomena, two processes that have been proposed, then we find that the rules that we must propose for the grammar is one where the underlying form is assumed to be that in column B, namely d. There is an insertion rule which says insert an E before a d when the stem ends in a t or d. So if you want, wanted, weighed, weighed, etc., etc. So just when the stem ends in a t or d, insert an E. No other change is required here. So the form d is found in bagged, the form d is also found in wanted. The wanted has an E insertion. And then there's another rule which accounts for devoicing of d to t. So when the stem ends in a voiceless consonant, then it changes to t. The voiceless consonants in English are p, t, k. Notice that we also have the fricatives here, s, sh, ch. The only consonant which is an exception is t here, the voiceless consonant. Now after t we already have an E insertion. So apart from t, all the other voiceless consonants, when they end in the stem, we have the voiced past tense morpheme d changes to t. So we have booked, bagged, and wanted. In this case here, 2 rules have been proposed: E insertion, devoicing. E insertion precedes devoicing. That's the way the 2 rules are related to each other. So we have come to the close of discussion in module 2, we looked at the various criteria that are used in choosing between analyses and choosing between rules in grammar of a language, and also the issue of choosing between analyses which require the simplest account of rule interaction in the grammar. Thank you.